Well, it's back for yet another video, another Rarest Steam Games video. Quite a few people have requested this one, and considering it's been a good 2 years since the last part, what better time to look at some more rare Steam games. And before we get any further, one game that was originally on my first video on this topic actually returned to Steam last year, that being none other than Stubbs the Zombie, which to me actually came across as one of the more unlikely games to return. After all, it was a pretty niche game release that had its right to publish stuck in limbo for a long time, but somehow Aspyr and THQ Nordic managed to get the publishing rights to re-release, which saw the game finally returning not only back to Steam, but the Xbox One, Series S and X, PS4 and PS5 in March 2021. And well, what a game it is. Hopefully more games return, but honestly I wouldn't be surprised if Stubbs is an exception for these lists, as a lot of these games that are removed usually are removed due to licensing issues, which are very rarely renewed after an extended period of removal. So just as always, I'm not necessarily looking at these games just as the price they go for, but also how rare they are to obtain, some of which might not even be obtainable now, either that being due to the fact it was removed before Steam gifting existed, or Steam keys for the game just simply disappearing. I will mostly be prioritising major AAA releases here, as if I were to include all games, then I'd be talking about some of the most dreadful, out there games from companies such as Digital Homicide, and I don't think anyone wants to hear about that. But without further ado, let's start the list. First off, let's start with one of the more well-known removals, that being From Software's Dark Souls Prepare to Die edition. Now, this one is a very interesting removal, as you can still buy the original Dark Souls on Steam, but that's only for the remastered edition. The original release though, yeah, it was removed shortly before the release of the remastered version back in May 2018, and pretty quickly keys for this game became quite expensive, to the point where you're now looking for it to be around £250 per copy of the game on Steam. Now, mind you, it doesn't mean this game is per se rare, but £250 for a game this iconic and beloved is insane, and honestly, it's not even a good version of the game. The infamy of how bad this release is common knowledge by now for many Dark Souls fans. It was a piss poor PC port that suffered from awful controls, a lack of settings to change, even lacking an option to change resolution. It was also locked at 30 FPS. Luckily though, a fan patch called DS Fix did fix a lot of these issues. With the release of the remastered edition though, it fixed essentially most of these issues, allowing settings to be changed and moved the FPS cap from 30 to 60 FPS. Whilst also sprucing the overall look of the game. Again, I wouldn't consider this game to be lacking in keys available to buy. After all, its removal compared to many other games wasn't too long ago, and keys for this game were always well stocked, but the demand for the game I'd say is what's driving the prices up. Dark Souls is without a doubt one of the most widely recognised gaming franchise nowadays. So many people are still actively trying to get this version to maybe complete their collection, even if they already own Dark Souls Remastered. For the second entry, I've decided to bunch 4 games together, as they were all removed at the same time and prices for them are also pretty consistent with one another, those being Duke Nukem 1, 2, 3D and Balls of Steel, all of which were removed in December 2015 and now usually go for about £300 each. Now, Duke Nukem 3D especially is a curious case here, as it actually has been removed from Steam twice, yet has a third version which is also available to buy on Steam. Why is that? Honestly, it seems to be some bullshit related to Gearbox, it seems. Apparently at the end of December 2015, the rights to the Duke Nukem franchise were switched from 3D Realms, who published these titles originally, to Gearbox, who were behind Duke Nukem Forever. But there's also another version on Steam called Duke Nukem 3D Megaton Edition, which wasn't published by 3D Realms, but Devolver Digital. That version got removed in February 2016 when their rights expired, and Gearbox just decided to remove that version from Steam, which meant for a time there was no version of Duke Nukem 3D. The only Duke Nukem game you could get on Steam was Duke Nukem Forever, and we know how much people love that game. Now, oddly, the Megaton edition only seems to be going around for £65 at the moment, but Jesus, £300 for the others? Well, Megaton edition was considered the ultimate version of Duke Nukem 3D at the time, and still is actually. Whilst the original releases were kind of there if you wanted to buy them, but lacked the improvements brought along by the Megaton edition, And it's not like Duke Nukem 1 and 2 were particularly as beloved, as they are pretty basic 2D platformers from the 90s. Balls of Steel, on the other hand, it's just pinball. It's just a pinball game with Duke Nukem plastered onto it. There's really not much else to it. Now, to make this whole Duke Nukem 3D removal situation even more confusing, the current version, which is available, Duke Nukem 3D 20th Anniversary World Tour, also got removed at one point back in January 2018. Now, admittedly this was only for 2 weeks, and apparently due to a DMCA claim. I honestly don't understand how that could have happened, but Gearbox did end up managing to get that back on Steam, as you can see. Now, here is another unique case in terms of removal, as it's a game that wasn't removed just once, but twice. And it's also a game on both lists beforehand I nearly mentioned, but decided not to. But due to the price of it now, I thought it was worth mentioning here now, and that being none other than Deadpool the video game. Like I say, removed not once, but twice, with its first removal in January 2014, only 6 months after its initial release actually. But then the game actually got re-added to Steam with its remastered version, which was announced in July 2015, only to get removed again in November 2017, for which it has yet to return from. Prices for this game seem to hover around £230 usually, and have actually for a good few years now. Again, it's not uncommon for Activision to have removed Steam games. As mentioned from my older list, they've got the Amazing Spider-Man 2, 2009's Wolfenstein, and the James Bond games, and many more that I've yet to mention. But for them to relist one, now that is unheard of. The fact that this game was re-added was kinda surprising. It was removed once Activision lost the rights to publish Marvel related games, yet somehow they regained the rights to publish Deadpool a year later. Many believe that this is due to them releasing it to coincide with the Deadpool movie, which released in 2016. The game itself is fine, the writing is pretty good I guess, but under all of that it's a pretty average action game with a budget that was way too high for what it ended up being, which also might be another reason for its re-release, funny enough. The game's budget was around 100 million, and just for it to be removed 6 months later after its release, I can kinda see Activision believing a re-release might help make that money back. After all, its so-called remaster, it was basically just a port to the next-gen consoles at the time. I don't know if I'd call this game overly rare again, which is partially why I've been on the fence about mentioning it. After all, when it did come back to Steam, I could see many game collectors quickly picking it up to avoid missing out on it being on Steam again for a relatively good price. But considering it's now been 5 years since its last removal, it is definitely becoming a bit more of an uncommon find to find in many people's Steam libraries. Fourth up is our odd entry for the list, because it's so goddamn cool that of course you want it in your Steam library, that being none other than Monster High New Ghoul in School. And why am I mentioning this game, I might be thinking? Well, its removal isn't anything too early, with it being around April 2017, but the price on the other hand, or at least the last recorded price, was a mind-boggling £3,000. Yeah, £3,000. I mean, I could try and make a joke about this, but no, it's just so absurd that it's kind of a joke in itself, even if it's a game as sick as Monster High New Ghoul in School. Do I know anything about this game? Not really. The best I can sum it up is you go around and do random activities such as dancing or give cookies to people. I honestly don't know. £3,000 worth it, I guess? Now, to be fair, that price is when it was the last time it was available to buy, and that was back in April 2021, and since then there's not really been much in terms of activity for buying this game. Most forum posts are just people asking for trading cards, but all things considered, I wouldn't be surprised if you could actually find a key for it. Just again, £3,000. There's a lot of things you could do with that money. You could go on a nice holiday with a few mates, you could invest in a new high-end PC, you could get Hank to call you a sussy backer at least 10 different times, you could buy 2 skins in Overwatch 2, or you could just buy 5 copies of Barbie Dreamhouse Party. Now, there is a game worth investing in. Next up, we have not one, but 2 games which, considering how similar they are, I decided to bunch up into one entry. those being both the Beijing 2008 and London 2012 Olympics video games. First, I want to talk about the London 2012 Olympics video game, which was removed in December 2013, just over a year after it being released, and prices for it now hover between £200 and £400, which, considering how long it's been removed from Steam, is actually quite lower than I'd expect it to be. But again, I assume that the demand for this game just isn't that high, which is actually kind of a shame to see, because personally I find it to be quite fun to play when bored and you're just chilling with mates. It's not especially an amazing game, but it's good mindless fun. And there's also the Beijing 2008 Olympics video game, which I've never played, but I'd assume it's more the same than the 2012 version, but obviously with a different locale. That too was also removed a year after its release, back in December 2009. But unlike the London 2012 Olympics game, I wasn't actually able to find a price for this game, and I'd consider this game to actually be unbuyable, meaning if you don't already have it on Steam, then you won't be getting it at all. Now, oddly enough, the Steam store page for this game was actually re-added in October 2015. It wasn't able to purchase, but you could view the Steam page for it, which you couldn't do for the London 2012 Olympics game, and even can't, even though that was released a good 4 years after, and also removed a good 4 years after the Beijing 2008 Olympics game. Honestly, not sure why that is. I doubt Sega were ever intending on re-releasing this, as why would they want to regain a license to it? But hey, it's there if you want to look at it. Also, there's the Tokyo 2020 Olympics game, and considering how the previous two titles were removed a year and a half after being released on Steam, I do recommend getting this by the end of this year if you do want to be on the Steam collection for a good price, as it wouldn't be surprising to me if come January 2023 that it'll too be removed. And now I'm going to be mentioning some more games which, just like the Beijing 2008 Olympics video game, might not actually be available to buy at the moment, and a reason for this is actually due to the fact that many of these games were removed before the implementation of Steam gifting in 2011, so essentially owning any of these games is quite a flex as a collector. And what better way to start talking about that than with a game that I didn't even know ever came to Steam, and possibly being the earliest game removal on Steam even, that being the Golden Compass video game. Were any of you aware that this game was once on Steam? Well, looking at the Steam community page for this game says otherwise, because there's only one forum post and 2 screenshots there. Originally published by Sega as a video game adaptation of the film, which was also an adaptation of the book of the same name, the Golden Compass seems to be removed from Steam between July 2009 and December 2009. Finding an accurate date for this game's removal was quite tricky, as the Wayback Machine records only told me that the game was still there in June 2009, but by December it was gone. And as I said before, this game's worth isn't available. There is essentially no chance that you'll still find a copy for this game if you don't have it already, which again it seems not many people do. And again, this removal isn't a massive loss personally. It was a pretty awful video game adaptation of an already awful film adaptation. I got gifted the PS2 version for Christmas the year it came out, and I remember playing it for about 20 minutes and then hating it. And I was only 7 at the time, so that kinda says a lot. At that age, I'd play any crap game and probably find some enjoyment. Its removal is pretty obvious due to the fact that Sega just probably lost the license, which happens a lot for many games for them in the late 2000s and early 2010s, where they were publishing quite a lot of video game adaptations and movies, again most of which weren't any good. Now, my next entry is a bit of a cheeky one, as I'm not entirely sure what was going on with this entry and its history on Steam, but it's a game that's really well known and apparently was once on Steam for an extremely brief period, and finding any reference to it being there is actually really difficult. And I'm not entirely sure if this game was something you paid for or was free to play like it is now, but believe it or not, League of Legends, yes, that League of Legends, was released on Steam back in November 2009 and was removed at some point early 2010, but I couldn't find a concrete date on it. And well, there is so little to find that it was ever on Steam that there is essentially no chance that you can still get it on Steam. So why am I mentioning this? Well, first off, a game this well known and huge being on Steam in itself at one point is insane to think about. Like, the fact there is so little known to show that this game was once on Steam is crazy, with a fanbase as huge as there is for League of Legends. But secondly, apparently it was a game that you had to purchase, as the version on Steam was a digital collector's edition. The only official thing I could find about this release was a statement made in 2012 after people did find League of Legends on the Steam database, to which they said, for a brief period of time after League of Legends launched in 2009, players could purchase a digital collector's edition of the game. This was distributed through a variety of channels via our European partners. We ended those distribution arrangements in 2010, but a small number of players still have this version of the game in their Steam inventories, so that's why occasionally it pops up. For what it seems, THQ are the reason for this game being on Steam, as they are linked as the publisher, and before people say, well then it's surely unplayable on Steam, well apparently there are people playing this version currently on Steam. Now admittedly the peak for this usually stands around low single digits usually, and it's possible that people are just using it to have hours in this game on Steam rather than being able to play it. I have no idea. Anyway, the game itself needs no introduction. It's considered one of the, if not the biggest MOBA games going, with a huge esports scene. I personally don't get the hype, I find it mind-numbingly dull, but each to their own. But owning this game on Steam does seem like some serious flex, as it's very out there and an unknown release. We now have a game which I kind of believe might be re-added at some point, though it's possible that it won't, and that being because I believe the publisher for this game still actually has the rights for it, or at least they have the rights to make a new game with the franchise, as it's none other than James Cameron's Avatar the Game, which was removed back in January 2013. And as it was removed after the Steam gifting system was introduced, it is possible there are keys for this game still going. Issue is I was unable to locate any, with one person inquiring to purchase a key for upwards of £2,000, and they didn't get a response. So it is possible that this game just isn't available to purchase anymore, but who knows. Anyway, as I was saying, I believe that Ubisoft could theoretically re-release this game. After all, they are developing Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, which is due to come out next year, so surely they still have the rights to re-release this game, surely then. Who knows, it's not the first time Ubisoft removed a game and mysteriously refused to re-add it. Also, the fact that there's no copies of this game going is kind of odd to me. It was a pretty big release. After all, it was an adaptation of Avatar, which wasn't exactly a film that flew under people's radar, and apparently the game was quite good in terms of video game adaptations of a film, though I never played it. And again, I find it even more possible that they could re-release this game, as Ubisoft did end up re-releasing Scott Pilgrim vs. the World video game in 2021, just over 6 years after that got removed. But then again, the demand for that re-release was more widespread, as it was a digital-only Xbox 360 and PS3 game that was beloved by many who played it, whilst the Avatar video game doesn't really ever seem to prop up and is also available on disc. Finally, we have two more games which are very unlikely to have any spare copies circulating, those being both the Incredible Hulk and Iron Man video games, which were both published by yet again Sega. Both of these were removed in December 2009 and, as I say, they are very unlikely to be purchased at all. Obviously, it seems that these games were both removed due to licensing issues. Now, Iron Man is a very curious case more so than the Incredible Hulk, as whilst both were removed due to licensing issues in 2009, Sega also published an Iron Man 2 video game in 2010. Now, admittedly the game was never released on PC, but there was one originally planned. Now, I couldn't find any details about when this version got cancelled, so it is possible that it was something related to not being able to publish Iron Man games on PC, but realistically, yeah, I just believe Sega just didn't want to extend the availability of Iron Man and the Incredible Hulk, as they both weren't particularly great games. In actuality, they were both awful, especially Iron Man. They both felt like soulless cash grabs instead of a product made out of love. Now, someone did try to request a copy of Iron Man, offering around $270 in 2014, but again it looks like there's no spare copies out there for these games, as they were both removed before implementation of the Steam gifting system. Now, I should mention that just because a game was removed before Steam's gifting system, doesn't mean that all games removed before then are unavailable to get keys from. After all, some games did include Steam codes on disc, but it was only a very small handful that did this. But in terms of a removed before Steam gifting, well, it only leaves you with both Football Manager 2009 and 2010, as everything else that included a Steam key with a physical edition were removed way after the Steam's gifting system was added. It's why you'll find both of these games at a relatively okay price considering how long they've been removed from Steam, and on top of the fact that frankly the demand for these games are very low. Anyway, that is all for yet another one of these lists. Chances are I'll probably do another one of these in a few years' time, as the removed Steam games library just grows and grows over time. I'm also looking into doing a list for PS2 games as well, as that scene is really interesting for me to look at, with some ridiculously expensive games going out there. As always, thank you for watching. If you do like the content I do, don't forget to subscribe. Also comment down below if you think there's any games that I missed out, and I'll be sure to cover it another time.